Morena koutou, no mai haere mai. Welcome to our session this morning, ka whawhai tonu mātou, mobilising for racial justice. Ko Wairoa, ko kairani ki tōku maunga, ko tuki tōku awa taki timu tōku waka, ko Ngāti Kangunu, rongo mai wahine o rangitāne ōku iwi, ko kairani ko Waipatu, ko Te Pairu ōku marae, ko India Mero Logan-Riley ahau. So my name's India. I'm from Kangunu. It's a beautiful day here today in Kangunu, of course, as usual. One of the little patches of paradise that I feel really lucky to call home. What we'll do is we'll just cover a little bit of the tikanga for our session, just in case folks haven't seen that already. So this is our safety net for the next few days, if you haven't seen it already, but just holding that we are curious and open and respectful, that we have respectful kōrero, that we make generous assumptions, and that we hold kindness and compassion around those assumptions, and that there's a degree of confidentiality, that this is a safe and sacred space, and so we'll treat the kōrero that is given with that respect and that sacredness as well. And that we speak for our own experience, because there'll be so many of us sharing big kōrero, and it's important that we speak from authenticity as well, and that we hold things lightly, and space for people to find their words as we go through. I'll definitely be asking for that. I can't find the flash words all the time, so I ask for your patience with that, and that we bring joy and fun into this space as well. But thank you all so much for joining. I feel so lucky to be helping hold this space this morning and sharing a bit of kōrero with Mereana. It's such an honor and a privilege to get to welcome Mereana into this space, and so I'll hand over to you, Mereana, for your kōrero and your mihi.
Kia ora tātou katoa, tēnei te mihi atu ki a tātou katoa, te ropu, ka whawhai tonu mātou, kia koe neira, o tō kōrero I tēnei ata, oku whanaunga, oku hoa, I ngā iwi o te motu nei tēnā koutou katoa to our overseas participants. Greetings to you all from the centre of the universe. Ngāti kahungunu. Ko Wairoa, ko whakapuna ki te maunga, ko Wairoa ho pupu hongene ngene mātangi rau te awa. Ko Ngāti Pākehā ka te hapu. Ko rongo mai wāhine, ko kahungunu oku tūpuna, ko kura haupō, ko tāki tumu oku waka, ko Ngāti kahungunu, ko rongo mai wāhine, oku iwi, ko ngaita manuhiri, ko Ngāti Porou, ko Ngāti Wai, me Ngāti Rangitāne oku iwi anō. My name's Mereana Pitman. I live on the east coast of the North Island of Aotearoa, and I'm amazed that everybody gave up their Saturday to come and listen to this. But I want to begin by saying that by no means an expert in racism, but in my life, I just want to do this in 3 parts. So I kind of want to talk a little bit about when I was younger and being raised in Wairoa. Wairoa was a very racist little town. I can hear my relations going nuts now, but it was clearly, if you go to Wairoa, there's a river that runs right down the centre of the town with a bridge. When I was growing up, 95% of white people lived on one side of the river, on the south side of the river, and 95% of Māori people lived on the other side of the river. So in my mind, there was always this kind of separation anyway. And all the shops, all the commerce, all the schools, almost all the schools were all on the other side of the river. The town was run from the other side of the river, and we were kind of like the poor relations on this side, the North Clyde side. I was raised during the 50s, 60s in Wairoa, so it was a time of great change. And one of the things that I remember being struck by quite early is that we had a very Māori upbringing. We worked most weekends at one of 5 or 6 marae that I whakapapa to. And my upbringing was all about work and about serving our people. So we would spend the weekends with hundreds, sometimes hundreds of our people, with our family at the pā. We would be cooking, laughing, playing bull rush, welcoming people, farewelling people, and mostly cooking and working though. And so it was our kind of, it was our school, our kura, in terms of being Māori. And then on Monday, we went back to our other lives. And we had run, spot, run, jump, spot, jump, Janet and John books. But one of the things I remember very early in my life, when I was about 7 or 8, is realizing that what happened on the weekends in my family was never a real part of what was happening at this thing called school. So there was this kind of split all the time of, there was the real Māori world, my world, our whānau world, and then there was this other world that you had to go to learn from these people. And I kind of coined it a kind of cultural schizophrenia, really, operating in 2 worlds all the time. I was brought up around Māori values, featured greatly in my upbringing. My mother was fiercely protective of her Māoritanga, and through my mother's whakapapa, I came from a very political orientated, activism orientated 100-year history. My great-grandfather was a follower of Te Kooti and lived with Te Kooti at Te Kuiti when he sought protection under the kingitanga and lived under the mantle of Maniapoto, Rewi Maniapoto, and the protection of Maniapoto. So my great-grandfather, along with a number of other chiefs from the Wairoa area, moved to live with Te Kooti, and that was a narrative inside our family all the time that I was growing up. So I was also brought up to understand and know whakapapa and the history of our people, especially my mother's family. My grandfather too was a member of the Kotahitanga Parliament, so in the 1890s joined the setting up of the separate Māori Parliament. So I always felt in my life that there was this kind of historical engine room behind me, political engine room behind me, and that through various stages of my life as I grew into activism, that those things were an important part of my life and gave me something to hang my hat on. The other thing that happened during the 50s and 60s when I was growing up, and I think it was like conscientisation by osmosis, is that I grew up in the times of the Bay of Pigs, the Vietnam War, the Czechoslovakian student riots, Yugoslavian, European student riots, the civil rights movement, the gay rights movement, and the women's movement were all vocal and during the time of the 60s and 70s. And so I remember sitting with my mother and my father watching our black and white television, watching things like the Nuremberg trials, watching people like Martin Luther King be assassinated, and the Kennedys and all those people, watching the draft dodgers in the United States and Muhammad Ali and all of that, listening to Jermaine Greer and Charlotte Bunch and watching Stonewall in terms of the gay riots. So I think by this kind of process of television osmosis. That was my first level of conscientisation after my own history. So I think it was just kind of natural that I would become who I was. I don't remember my life experiencing racism full on in my face in an overt manner. But I remember one of the things I hated, and it's a reason why I can't really get into kapa haka these days, is that when I was a child, the only time that Māori things Māori and Māoritanga was reflected in my community was when an important government minister or prime minister was being welcomed to Wairua, and we were dragged out, Māori, in our piu and our bodices to greet and welcome them. And even though that was a part of being Māori, to welcome your visitors, I also felt like it kind of, I remember the laughing at the haka and putting all the really nice, pretty young Māori women in the front row and all the big tall ones like me in the back row. But you know, there was this kind of entertainment kind of value. And that's what I remember from kapa haka. So I don't enjoy kapa haka these days for that reason. I like going to watch it, and I love listening to the lyrics and finding out how that song might have been composed, that waiata might have been composed, and the reason why. But I don't enjoy the entertainment value that is attached to it. So I have a whakapapa of resistance, and I also had the political conscientisation of the 60s and 50s. What moved me to become an activist was that my children, I think, were about just before they went to school in the 1970s. By the way, my children are 49 today, so happy birthday to both of them. Can't believe I've got 49-year-old children. I remember just before they went to kura, I turned on the television to watch the news one night, and I saw columns of policemen walking up the Mission Bay Road. And I remember being really physically sort of struck by that and kind of blown back into my seat. And I sat there and watched them as they progressed to go up the hill and onto Takaparafa. And then over the ensuing days, watched them pull a marae down and arrest kraua and kuia. So in my world, in my Māori world, that was just abhorrent to do that, to go onto somebody's marae, to dismantle it, to arrest kraua and kuia and jail them and take them away in buses, to not listen to the people, to not listen to what was happening. All of those things were like, it just kind of catapulted me off my couch and to Auckland. When I arrived in Auckland, the engineering students were Head Tail was having a little dispute with the engineering students. So I kind of walked straight into that and became involved in Māori land rights movements, gay rights movements, women's movement. And so it was a great time of conscientisation for me. And got to participate in protests like the Springbok Tour. And so over those years, the whole issue of racism, later on in my life, I became a decolonisation treaty educator, and in researching about that, ended up back at the Doctrines of Christian Discovery, which I think is the template that was set in the 15th century for the colonisation of the indigenous world. And the Dum Diversus papal bull that was put out in the 15th century around 1492 said essentially, which was an agreement between the Portuguese monarchy, private enterprise, the traders or the explorers, inverted commas, and the church, put out a papal bull providing the moral reasoning behind colonisation, that they were given the right in their exploration of the inverted commas new world to go into those countries, to hold those people in perpetual slavery, to covet their lands, to take their resources, and to kill, basically, those who were not Christian, were not white. And I think, for me, you know, the beginnings of racism come around that time of the papal bulls. And over the next 600 years, if you track the history of the, you know, of indigenous peoples, and especially in Australia, Aotearoa, the United States of America, and Canada, you clearly see the impact of how racism is institutionalized in the process of colonisation and becomes a part of how you colonize people. So when the next thing is that when Cook arrives here, the first thing he does is that he goes on his travels to Ranganui-a-Kiwa. And I kind of dispute this whole thing around, you know, Cook discovered us. We were not discovered, we weren't lost, actually. We have been here for over 1,000 years. And brought to this country by a Māori woman on her own waka, Kura Marotini, and her waka from her father was gifted. Kupe kind of happened along with her, but she came, she saw, and she brought the people to the land. So I've forgotten where I was. Have I forgotten where I was? Yeah, so colonisation, inherent in colonisation is the whole thing around racism. So they come here, Cook comes here, the first thing he does is he goes into Ranganui-a-Kiwa, promptly shoots 3 or 4 people, some major whakapapa on the East Coast, kidnaps some young children, releases them here at Cape Kidnappers in Ngāti Kahungunu. So without any discussion, this is, you know, from a people who are used to talking to each other, having discussions, having 3, 4 day, 5 day wānanga to resolve issues between themselves, into this white man sails in and begins to fire upon our people at Ranganui-a-Kiwa. From then on, it just gets worse and worse. But what I have to say is that even though the process of colonisation, we move through war, legislative racism, etc., all the way through, right through to today, into assimilation, Māori resisted all the way through that. Māori resisted. It isn't true. I often hear as a treaty educator, you know, but what did our people do? They did nothing. Our people actually fought, took up arms, they were incarcerated, and during that whole time, you know, we resisted right through. We still resist, even though resistance has become a very personal thing now. It's a personal decision. I'll just say a little bit about that right at the end. So we resisted right through, and there are huge examples. There are examples all over Aotearoa of our people resisting. We attempt, our people set up separate organisations, the kingitanga, whose kaupapa originally was to stop the sale of land, to cease the sale of land, the whawhai movement, which was set up in 1865 by Te Ua Haumene e Taranaki again to stop the taking of and the theft of land, the legislation to Te Whiti and Tohu Kākahi and Te Whiti o Rungomai, and the setting up of Parihaka, again to stop the taking of land, the ploughmen that came out of Parihaka, the fences that came out of Parihaka, and the huge amount of legislation that was racist that came out of Parihaka as well, the Māori Prisoners Act, the New Zealand Settlement Act, which introduced raupatu confiscation to our people and confiscated millions of acres of land from those who fought against the Crown, against the government. So that resistance continued, with movements continued to be set up, and a number of prophets came to the fore. And the really interesting thing about those prophets is they married mātou ranga Māori, the Māori values and belief systems, with theology and the teachings of Christianity, and became very powerful at a time where we had had land stolen, we had been separated from each other, we had no longer had access to our resources. But when you look at colonisation, that is what it is designed to do, and racism helps that. It's designed to separate us from each other. Colonisation separates us from the land, from the resources, from our own whanaunga, and from our atua. And so it's any wonder that today we have the negative statistics that we do have around violence and around abuse. I find racism, that sort of institutional racism that colonisation brings, to be very, be quite sick and quite violent. Very violent. It's, racism to me is an act of violence. In our laws here around domestic violence, we have verbal and psychological abuse attached to family violence. We should have racism in there as well, because racism is in itself violent and has a terrible effect on our people, and a cumulative effect over 150 years. So there was a resistance right through to 1900s and beyond that as well. But from about 1900s onwards, we have coming to the fore a number of prominent Māori, very well educated in terms of mātou ranga Māori, but also in terms of Pākehā education. Maui Pōmare, Te Rangi Hiroa, and Apirana Ngata. And they come to the fore and begin 70 years of assimilation and trying to prove ourselves as citizens of this country. One of the biggest things about assimilation for me that was really racist is that when I was going to kura, right through all my years at kura, through academic studies, except for when I went to Te Wānanga or Raukawa, is that the benchmark of success was Pākehā. It was a white benchmark that you were successful if you reached this level. If you got this amount of points on your school certificate, you were a success if you majored a number of Pākehā benchmarks. And that was one of the things that had a huge effect on our people, because it's like being set up to fail. That those who didn't make those benchmarks were under assimilation regarded as failures and put over there, and I think became the pipeline, who didn't behave properly, who didn't respond properly to Pākehā. The Pākehā world, where the Royal Commission on Abuse at the moment has a litany of narratives around that. What happened to those who, inverted commas, failed to reach the benchmark at primary school, failed to reach the benchmark at secondary school, and in later years, they became the pipeline through to residential homes, through to Borstal, through to Kohitere and places and live in like that, and through eventually to prison. And so the intergenerational impact of institutional racism and that came with colonisation has been huge for us. Yeah.
Well, I'll jump in with a question there, Mereana, if you'd like. And also, of course, I invite the audience to write questions as well. As we know with the last session, there were so many questions that we couldn't get around to all of them, so I'll just apologise in advance if we don't answer your question, but please shoot them through in the Q&A box. I think personally, and there's so many Mātou that I have, but I think what comes to mind for me as a rangatahi Māori is, you're speaking about your experiences of racism as a kid. And I remember when I first realised that there was a significant portion of people in Aotearoa who did not like me when the foreshore and seabed happened. As a child, I was a child when that happened. I remember seeing the iwi versus Kiwi billboards, and that's when I kind of realised that there was a bigger battle going on than what I just experienced as a kid. But I was wondering if you have any advice or insights around our rangatahi who are coming up in this space, who might want to be activists or who are just trying to get by, who are just trying to survive in this racist system. And maybe you haven't quite unpicked some of that internalized stuff, whether you have any advice for our rangatahi who are dealing with that kind of mamai.
Probably my first advice is that being an activist is not a good career move. It's it takes a lot of time away from your children. One of my things to my twins this morning on Facebook was an apology to them for them having to endure years of living with a mother who is an activist and whose work often became first. And I've seen over the years my children suffer from that. One of the things that I learned the most during the 60s was that there was so much resistance and revolution in the 60s. Why? Because people started to find their voices and started to speak out. And they started to say, you can't do that, that's not right, that's not just. I don't like being treated like this. And so for me, that was a huge learning thing too, having come from a whakapapa, and certainly women in my whakapapa who were the bosses, and were very strong in where they were coming from and could organize things really, really well, to learning during the 60s that revolution came because people started to say things. And I think in terms of one of the things that racism does to us psychologically, emotionally, is that it makes us frightened. But it also, if you can handle facing the fear, you can find your voice. And you need to say, I watch Facebook every now and then where the young people are treated really badly in shops, on their garages, and next minute it's all over Facebook, and I think, good on you. Good on you that you did that, good on you that you spoke out, good on you that you called it out. And I think that's one of the things, is that we have to find our voice. We have to find our voice. You have to find your voice, rangatahi. And you have to start to say, well, hang on a minute, and never be afraid to ask questions. I don't remember any time in my life in the Māori world ever being afraid to ask my mother, her sisters, and my nannies anything. We could talk to them about anything. We could ask them quite risque questions sometimes. We already kind of knew how far we could go with our parents and our nannies, but we could always have the kōrero. And so I know it doesn't sound like much, but have the kōrero and learn to find your own voice and learn to say where you're coming from, because you'll be surprised that once you do start to say, there are allies, there are people who think the same way as you. There are people around who have had the same experiences as you have, and they will come along and they will stand alongside you, and then together you have, you have the tools to, it's better, there's 5 or 6 of you not buying from that shop that was really racist. It's or standing and challenging people. It's so much better than just you standing by yourself. You are not alone in what you think, and you need to stand up for yourself. The other thing about racism is that it attempts to define you, redefine who you are, which is about, the first lesson learned by any colonized people is to define yourself. You must define yourself. You're not the Maoris, you're not the natives, you're not the savages, you're not the whatever it is that they call us at different times of our history. I'm Ngāti Kaunena, and I'll just tell you a little story. I went to New York one time. I've told the story, and I went to register at the United Nations. We were there for the CEDAW committee, and this Negro man said to me, "Who are you, girlie?" And at the time, I was just about 40. I thought to myself, having been schooled in feminism, I don't know who he thinks he is calling a girlie, but I said to him, "Oh, my name's Mereana Pitman. Where are you from, girlie?" I said, "I'm from Aotearoa." And what are you? And I said, "I'm Māori, and I belong to a tribe, iwi, called Ngāti Kahungunu." He said to me, "I know you, you're Australian." And I went, no, I'm not Australian. I am from the South Pacific, but I'm not Australian. And "I know you, you're a New Zealander." I said, "No, I'm not a New Zealander, I'm Māori." And so, that fight to retain your own identity, I think, is really important, but the exploration of your own identity, I think, is part of what rangatahi need to do, is to go back into their own history, to find the resistors, to find those who stood on their land and said, "Well, actually, you can't come in here." To find out who you are gives you more power to your voice and your narrative when you're coming from a truthful place. Yeah. I don't know, it doesn't sound like much, but it helps when we do that.
I think, I fully appreciate it. Thank you so much. And I think it's such an interesting thing around the cost of activism as well, because I know, like, even my mum, who wasn't necessarily an activist but still works in Māori health, that there's a lot of time spent away doing the mahi and the training. I was kind of wondering, because you've seen the anti-racism movement shift and grow and change over several decades now. I wonder if, from when you started to now, is there anything in particular that's stayed the same, and anything in particular that's changed a lot in terms of how we resist and what works?
I think that Indigenous peoples around the world, all around the world, like the Black Lives Matter movement, all those movements that are anti-racism movements, we've moved 1,000 miles, but white people have not moved at all. White people still cling to their ignorance and their stereotypes and fall back into that safe place of categorizing everybody. And that's the thing that doesn't change, but we have changed a lot. And I think partly because we have taken control of our own education increasingly with, ko hangareo, we've made choices for ourselves. Kura kaupapa Māori, whare wānanga. We now can go right through a holistic Māori system of education. We've many, not me, have done lots to reclaim around te reo Māori, around mātou Māori. So we've done a lot. And that's a big change from the 50s and 60s from being stuck in an assimilative kind of we are all one and we're the happy little guitar playing, laughing, singing Māoris from Aotearoa, and we all live in this kind of land of racial harmony. I think we've broken through that mold and we've started to discover our own identity and our own narratives, but white people haven't moved at all. And that often to me is quite sad, you know. I refuse now to teach white people anything about what I'm talking to you about this morning, because I believe that other white people who are conscientized, like the ropi that is running this, and tangata tiriti, the Asian against tino, you know, for tino rangatiratanga movements, all those tau iwi, you need to be in there conscientizing your own people. The challenge needs to come from you. Otherwise, if it doesn't, then the narratives that come from people like Mr. Brash and Muriel, our friend Muriel Newman, they're just going to reinforce the stereotypes that already exist amongst many white people. I know there are many white people out there that are doing work in anti-racism, and I applaud that, but it's not our job. It's not our job to go and conscientize white people about racism. It's your job. You go and do that work. It's been really interesting in the last 2 days to see all the feedback and listen to radio talkback, which I often do, around the new history curriculum for Aotearoa. Because in actual fact, all our people are really positive about it, and we could do this and we could do that, and this might be a way through and that might be a way through. But all the white people coming on Facebook are kind of like throwing their hands up in horror and saying, but you know, how come we're portrayed as villains and they're portrayed as victims? And the young woman from the ACT Party and whatever his name is, Mr. Seymour from the ACT Party, stirring the stereotypes, stirring the ignorance, you know, and not layering any growth or development on top of that. Yes, we all know what we want. You all know what we want. You want us all to be kind to each other, and you want us all to be one. But we can't be one if you don't move. If we're doing all the movement and you're not moving, we can't be one people. And anyway, some of us don't want to be one. We're already one with each other. Why would we want to encompass another way? You know, it's not our job to conscientize you. You need to go out and get yourself conscientized by your own people.
There's so many questions coming through, so I'm going to try and mix some together. But I think there's some really interesting ones around. So someone who's asked if you think there is a space for forgiveness in the space of trauma and or racism imposed upon us as Māori. And then the other kind of complexity to that is, you know, how do we navigate our relationships with Pākehā in our lives if they're not doing that moving? And if some of that mamai, as we dive deeper into our whakapapa, starts coming up interpersonally with Pākehā that we might be friends with. Yeah.
Hey, what was the first bit?
Just if there's space for forgiveness.
Yeah. You know, in the whole time that I was being raised under Māori values and beliefs, hauhaurunga and tātai pounamu are an integral part of that process. So manaakitanga, reciprocity, all of those things are part of the process of growing up Māori, and of course there is, but in many ways in Māoridom too, forgiveness has its own pathway and its own way of coming. It's not something that you go and beg Jesus Christ for, or, you know, go down on your hands and knees and beg anybody for. It's a process of working through, of kōrero, of fronting up kanohi ki te kanohi, so it has its own kawa and protocols attached to it. But of course there is, you know, it's not all about. It's not that I don't dislike Pākehā people. They're there, they're a reality, they're in our world. I have to go down and buy my newspaper every morning from Pākehā people, actually Indian people. But I find increasingly in my life, just to be truthful, that Pākehā have very little to do in my life, that I don't socialise with Pākehā people very much. I don't talk to Pākehā people very much because mine is a Māori world. I work with Māori people. I buy my vegetables from Māori people. I often shop at Māori shops. You know, my world is not encompassing. I'm not sure that I have many Pākehā friends. I have Pākehā allies. I have Pākehā people who are onto the same kaupapa and work towards the same thing that I do. And I'm really happy to go and tautoko the Heather Cairns and the Tim Howards and the Moya Armstrongs and people like that of the Pākehā world to, you know, to help with that work, but not to directly work with Pākehā, but to work and help with the people who teach Pākehā that stuff, yes. So in my life, there's not much interaction with Pākehā people. They are there to serve my needs, really.
All right, there we go. That's the wisdoms.
Okay, sorry if it sounds a bit harsh, but that's the way it is.
And I think that, you know, that really is honest about the complexities that arise because the personal is political and the political is personal. And so it's going to show up in our interpersonal relationships and how can we navigate that and based on those values around, you know, conflict resolution and transformative justice and those kinds of things. We've got, I think it's a really relevant question here around kind of the need for solidarity from Māori to other communities who are also experiencing racism. The question here is, it's a pātai from a migrant to Aotearoa, Black African woman. She comes from they come from a people who have experienced British colonialism in Ghana and racial oppression in America, but sometimes get lumped or addressed as if a colonizer. There seems to be a disconnect at times in aligning our collective struggles in anti-racism. So how can we bring Māori along, right? And I think this is so relevant because over the last couple of weeks, we've seen major discussions on social media around anti-Blackness in Māori communities. And just, yeah, how can we align those movements of solidarity? Yeah.
Well, I've just spent the last almost 42 years now of my life educating our people. I have made about 25 years ago, I made a deliberate choice to educate only our people, because if I would stop and educate others, you know, 10 of our people would be walking past going, so why aren't you, you know, you should come and talk to us. So I think that we need to wānanga together a lot more and to kōrero face to face with each other and host each other and talk about those things with each other. We do have the same ideas and notions around race, etc., but we have different methodologies. We've got different tawa. We have different protocols about working through those things. I remember a time, you know, during the 60s and 70s, there were women in armed struggle, like the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the IRA women. And I remember going to this hui once, and it was interesting where we ended up. There was a social justice, land struggles, armed struggles, and Māori in the middle, trying to be the moderators and the mediators, and not trying to please everybody, but trying to find our way through a whole lot of issues like that. And I think the more we can kōrero to each other, but, you know, not go to our corners and stand there and kind of not talk to each other properly. We need to talk to each other properly. Yeah.
Hāpai. Sounds, yeah, I definitely agree. And that's really hard in a pandemic when it's unsafe to hang out with each other, but hopefully we can do more of that in the near future. I was wondering, because, you know, we talked a lot about racism and the struggle and it's hard. What is it that you're holding hope for? What is it that you're hoping for the world to come that we're working on making?
What do I hope for in my little world? Hope that my granddaughters and grandsons grow up to have balls and can talk and can speak and can challenge and confront and can love. And I don't know what I hope for. I just, yeah, I kind of feel, I've always felt a sense of destiny about what I do in my life. It's not up to me, really. It's up to those mokopuna, those grandchildren and great-grandchildren, about how about us making them strong enough to be able to conduct themselves in honest and truthful ways, and to be able to take challenge and stand up. You know, yeah, I don't know that I have anything past that, because it's not my world. I'm responsible for what we have in this world now, and there are, you know, a multitude of environmental, climate change things going on that we're responsible for, that we're trying to kind of influence and turn around. I worry that my grandchildren and other grandchildren, mokopuna around the world, I worry about the legacy that we leave them, and whether or not they're tough enough, strong enough to be able to survive the big, huge, fat mess that we're in. Yeah.
Quite a mess, yeah. Do you, we've got a few questions here around, do you have any advice for people who are working in the Crown or in local government who are Māori, and how they might keep themselves safe in that space and look after themselves whilst trying to do mahi in the kāwanatanga sphere?
Yeah, I think that, yeah, you have to be really, really careful. I was watching last night on television the death of the eulogies being paid to Woodard Gardner. And Woodard Gardner was the quintessential public servant, you know. And I was thinking, I watched Tone Harawera's eulogy to him, or his mihi to him, and I thought, what would I say? And I thought, it's better not to say anything, because nothing that I would say would be good about his time. And that he was, you know, he was a great man in many other ways, but I found him extraordinarily difficult that he was used. And I think that when it comes to Crown agents or agents of the Crown, you have to be very aware of where the line is between yourself and whether or not you are Māori working for the Crown. You know, who are you working for? Those things are always going to come to you if you work for the government. If you work for the government, you always have to be aware that you're going to make them look good all the time, you know, and they are going to use you all the time to be the māngai, to be the mouthpiece, to be the front person, to go out there and have the battles with us, etc., etc. But we know what you're doing. We know who you are. I'm not anti our people working for the government. I just think that it's a reality, you know, and that we can influence some change. I think a really important part of if you work for the government is to conscientise yourself and to make sure you know what you're doing. Make sure that you know how to do that and that you're not being used by other people.
Yeah, that's the reality of it. I think I definitely agree. I want to go back to one of the threads in your kōrero around wahine and the fact that it was a wahine who came to Aotearoa and Kupe was along for the ride. Of course, this is really timely with the mana wahine inquiry with the tribunal and that kind of thing. Is there anything in particular that you would kind of want to share around the mana of wahine in activism and in this change-making work?
Wow. Can you ask me that again, slowly?
Yeah, I just, it's okay, we're nearly done. So it's coming to the end of the hour. I just thought it might be nice to pick up on some of those wahine threads that you were talking about in the kōrero that you gave earlier. And are there any particular thoughts or insights that you have around the mana of wahine in activism and in anti-racism work?
Well, some of the, just about all the greatest mentors and activists that I had in my life through my period of time, my time as an activist have been women. I go, the contemporaries, the greatest contemporaries, the ones that I respect, are women. There have been the men, and that's been really great, but the Eva Rickards, especially Auntie Eva, and Tita Whai, Suni Kora, all those women were really important in our development as women, and the strength that we have taken from each other, because our individual experience as women in terms of coming through the domestic violence, living with partners, bicultural relationships, etc., all of those issues have brought us closer together in our protection and work with each other. But I stumbled, I've been doing a little bit of work with another ropu of people around kupe and the first law of the land. And then through Jean and something that I read that she had written, I came across this whole thing that actually kupe came with her on her waka, with kura marotini on her waka, mātou, that was gifted to her by her people, by her parents, by her father. He came here with her, and that suddenly this narrative is that kupe came and the boys were here, and it was all about the boys. But in actual fact, it was her. And so the reclamation of those stories of great women in our whakapapa. In my whakapapa, I have generations of strong, powerful women who organised their families, who gave birth to upwards of 26 children. Women in my whakapapa who had 7 or 8 relationships and had children to them all, and survived and raised those children and never turned their back on them, and didn't get sucked in by the morality of the others, still went and attended karakia and church, and went and helped and all those sort of things. So for me, I wouldn't be here doing what I'm doing if it wasn't for the many strong women in my life and the contemporaries that I have now, who are there to support and tautoko. And we can sit down and we can laugh and we can cry and we can listen to each other's struggles.
Kia ora, thank you.
Okay.
We just have 1 or 2 more questions, quick ones.
Yeah.
We're almost done, but there's someone here asking if you can define the word conscientise for people, because that might be a new word for some folks. So when you're talking about conscientisation, what does that mean?
The process of conscientisation, it actually comes from Wairoa, is the process of making people aware, of another, of the other story, the other narrative, the real narrative, the truth about things. The process of conscientisation, and building that awareness to a political understanding. Yeah.
Awesome. And I thought, just as my final part, because we probably should wind up here, is you talked about making kai as a kid and being at the marae and making kai for people. What is your favorite grounding kai after you've done some mahi?
Sweet corn on toast.
Sweet corn on toast. I've not had that before. Works for kaingu,
Cream corn.
Cream corn.
Toast. Yeah. It's my
there we
ground.
go, whānau.
Okay. I've got lots of grounding kai, but kai generally is, for me, it's the great encompasser, You can heal lots by saying to people, shall we go and have a kai? let's sit down and have a kai and have a, because with kai comes kōrero, and with kōrero often there comes resolution, growing kai, whatever. So I was brought up really to, you know, kai featured really important. We had huge gardens when I was growing up. It was lots of work. I just remember lots of work, but there was lots of rewards out of kai, and we were probably a lot healthier then than we are now, because none of the kai that we had when I was a child was processed kai. We had to go and dig it, look for it, shoot it, smoke it, dive for it. We had to work for our kai in those days, and so those things we did together with each other, and they were important things. So kia ora, India.
Yeah, thank you. All right, whānau, we're gonna stop the session there. Thank you so much for coming. Everyone is commenting in the chat that the sweet corn on toast they really enjoy it too. So thank you.
There you go.
Yeah, inspiring everyone. We're getting hungry for lunchtime because it's pretty much lunchtime. It's a good idea. But yeah, thank you so much for this kōrero. Honestly, such a blessing. And thank you for taking this time. I know Zoom is not the favorite. So thank you for joining. And yeah, honestly, I'll be thinking about this kōrero for a long time, pulling out the little gems. So yeah, we'll close on that, whānau, and catch you at the next session. All right.
Thank you for moderating the session. And I look forward to meeting up with you face to face.